Last time we spoke about the Battle of Lake Tai. In November of 1937, as Japanese forces advanced, Nanjing's fate hung in the balance. Commander Tang Shengzhu led the desperate defense amidst disarray amongst the other Chinese generals, many advocating for a general retreat. Despite political strife, civilians rallied, fortifying the city, knowing its fall could destroy Chiang Kai-shek's government. On November the 19th, the Japanese commander, Yanagawa, seized the moment, directing his troops towards Nanjing, igniting panic in Tokyo. As fierce battles erupted around Lake Tai, the Chinese forces, though outmatched in technology, employed guerrilla tactics and stubborn resistance. Chinese artillery delivered devastating blows, and bold counterattacks kept the Japanese momentum in check. However, as the month closed, the tide began to turn. Logistical challenges and internal chaos hampered communication. The stage was set for one of the darkest chapters in modern Chinese history, where the battle for Nanjing would symbolize the struggle against oppression. This episode is Nanjing Surrounded. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released the third part, my four-part series covering the Japanese invasion of North China and Inner Mongolia, this episode titled Operation Chahar. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast is on why exactly did Japan surrender during World War II? The answer might surprise you. On December the 1st, Jiang Ying fell. That same day, the Japanese Army General Staff Deputy, Chief Tada Hayo, arrived to Shanghai to conduct an inspection of the front lines and personally deliver Tokyo's orders authorizing an assault upon Nanjing. The directive was exceptionally brief. The Central China Area Army is to attack Nanjing in coordination with the Navy. Later that same day at about 7 p.m., more detailed instructions were issued by the Central China Area Army. The 10th Army was set to begin its decisive assault on Nanjing, set for December the 3rd. They would be advancing along two primary routes towards the capital. The left flank was to advance through Wuhu, while the right flank would move via the city of Liushui. The Shanghai Expeditionary Force, having endured more strain than the 10th Army, due to its longer tenure at the front, was scheduled to launch its attack about 2 days later, concentrating its forces around Danyang and Jurong. On December the 2nd, Matsui received a promotion, given overall command of the Central China Area Army. The responsibility for the Shanghai Expeditionary Force was then entrusted to a recent appointee in the Shanghai Theater, Prince Asaka Yasuhiko, a member of the imperial family. As Matsui noted in his diary that day, "It is a great honor." He promptly issued orders to ensure the prince's comfort and safety by all available means. At the age of 55, Prince Asaka, Emperor Hirohito's uncle, boasted a successful military background, including a tenure at the Japanese embassy in Paris. However, this experience had left its mark on him in two significant ways. He walked with a limp due to a car accident in France, and he spoke French fluently. Despite his talents and efforts, he did not earn the highest regard from Hirohito, as he had not demonstrated loyalty expected of him during the February 26 coup attempt in 1936, and ever since then he'd been met with a cold shoulder from the emperor. Command in China presented a crucial opportunity for him to restore his standings in the eyes of the emperor. Meanwhile, over in the capital, a war for air supremacy raged. More and more Soviet pilots were arriving alongside their Polikarpov I-16 fighters. Exhausted from the long-distance travel to Nanjing, the Soviet pilots were given absolutely no respite. They were tossed directly into the fray, performing 5 sorties in their first days. The Soviets were kept very busy as the Japanese increasingly unleashed raids against the airfields in and around Nanjing. The raids became so intense the Chinese had to relocate their aircraft to bases hundreds of miles behind the front. Now, while the Polikarpov I-16 were severely hampering the Japanese, suddenly a new adversary emerged, the Mitsubishi A-5M fighter, a prototype which was rushed into service to help escort the bombers. This was the predecessor to the legendary A-6M Zero fighter. And I think I've mentioned this already, but I actually wrote an episode for Kings and Generals over on the YouTube channel about the entire history of the A-6M Zero fighter. I also used notes for that episode to create a very long format podcast, which is on my Patreon. It's a pretty interesting aspect of Japanese history. Really, a lot of tech stuff. It's more for the geeks out there, I'd say. But if you're interested, please go check it out. But needless to say, the A-5M changed everything in the theater, taking away the advantage the Soviet fighters had wielded for a brief window of time. At 9 a.m. on December the 2nd, a small customs cruiser waving a swastika flag docked at Nanjing's waterfront after making an overnight journey down the Yangtze River from Wuhan. German ambassador Oskar Trautmann quickly disembarked, accompanied by embassy counselor Heinz Lochtenschlager and the Chinese vice foreign minister Xu Mo. Trautmann's mission was so secretive that although he had dined with a secretary from the Italian embassy, another Axis partner, just hours before departing Wuhan, he made no mention of his impending trip. Despite the secrecy surrounding his visit, news of Trautmann's arrival in Nanjing spread rapidly within the German community. As businessman John Labe noted in his diary that day, "I assume his return has something to do with Germany's attempt to act as mediator." Prior to Trautmann's arrival, Chiang Kai-shek had just had a meeting with his closest advisors, primarily military generals. Vice Foreign Minister Xu briefed those present on the peace conditions proposed by the Japanese nearly a month prior. Many in the attendance were hearing these terms for the first time. They were startled to discover that Japan did not require reductions in Chinese armaments. Bei Changxi was the first to speak. "If these are the only terms, then why should there be a war?" Given that the Japanese proposal seemed to allow for the continuity of the Kuomintang, leading the Chinese nation, the generals present, including Tang Shengzhu, agreed to use it as a basis for negotiations. Later at 5 p.m., Chang met with Trautmann. The German diplomat said, "I believe it is necessary for China to declare its willingness to discuss the Japanese terms in a conciliatory spirit." To this, Chang replied, "I intend to do so, but I also expect the same from Japan." Chang then explained he needed to be addressed for peace talks with Japan to proceed, explicitly stating that he would not accept Japanese control over northern China and that he was unwilling to sacrifice his recent friendship with the Soviet Union to achieve a peace with Japan. Having secured Chang's agreement to initiate talks with Japan, Trautmann promptly returned to the German embassy to report to his superiors in Berlin. He then headed back to the docks, boarding the same vessel that brought him to Nanjing, traveling all the way back in the dark over the Yangtze River. One particular concern weighed heavily on Trautmann's mind: a request from Chang to maintain absolute secrecy regarding the upcoming sino-Japanese negotiations. Trautmann believed that Germany should support this request. He was convinced that if news leaked about Chang's willingness to engage with the despised Japanese, it could spell the end of his government, and that might allow the Soviets to take charge. At this time, both the Germans and Japanese feared fragmenting China further. Both actually wanted the Kuomintang to remain in charge and maintain the status quo, as it benefited both of them greatly. Staff Officer Kawabe Torashiro, after a recent tour of the front lines, had this to say: "To dismantle the Chang regime would leave it in a dire strait, giving it the desperate tenacity of a cornered rat in a struggle against Japan. Whether we destroy it or not, we would ultimately contribute to a fragmented China for many, many years, one that would be a significant drain on the empire's resources well into the future." Very prophetic words, given what happens. Meanwhile, the city of Chongzhou fell on December the 2nd without any resistance. Private Azumashiro landed at Chongzhou, and he was ordered alongside his 20th Regiment to prepare an assault upon Danyang, which was a walled city located about 25 miles northwest of Chongzhou. The road between the two locations was nearly straight, running parallel to a railway line connecting Shanghai and Nanjing, allowing the 20th Regiment to make pretty swift progress. Upon arriving at Danyang, Azuma's platoon cautiously approached a bamboo grove concealing a Chinese position. Suddenly, Czech-made ZB-VZ-26 machine guns opened fire. Taking cover, the Japanese soldiers entered a nearby cemetery, where the small grave mounds offered some protection. The platoon's knee mortars responded, firing shells that silenced the machine gun. Seizing the opportunity, they launched their assault, swords raised and bayonets fixed, shouting banzai at the top of their lungs. As they closed the distance to the bamboo grove, the machine guns sliced them down. When they finally reached the trench, they discovered it was already abandoned. The occupants had already fled. Danyang also fell on December the 2nd, clearing one of the most significant obstacles in the 16th Division's path to Jurong. Meanwhile, to the south, the 9th Division was advancing from Tangwangxi towards Chun-Hui village, just a few miles from the capital, while elements of the 3rd Division were also making significant headway. At the northern end of the front, the Amaya detachment was approaching the Yangtze port city of Zhenjiang, preparing to cross the river and sweep west along the opposite bank. As Matsue noted in his diary that day, "The enemy's entire defensive line has been breached, and their morale has declined sharply. I believe there won't be much fight left in them moving forward." Although the Shanghai Expeditionary Force had yet to launch its final assault upon the capital, the soldiers were managing to advance at an impressive pace. Matsue noted in his diary on December the 4th, "I plan for orderly occupation of Nanjing. Before entering the city, we must offer Chiang Kai-shek, or the garrison commander, the opportunity to surrender. While occupying Nanjing, I hope we can avoid unnecessary damage to the city and not harm the populace." Over in the capital, Henri Johann Dietrich de Fremarie, a Dutch officer serving as an advisor to the Chinese army, had assessed the city's fortifications prior to the war, and he found them lacking. He noted that the coastal batteries had been installed to the north and the northeastern parts of the city, including outdated muzzle loaders. In his report, he stated, "They might serve against warship attacks, but who would think of attacking this city with warships?" Although some artillery pieces were positioned along the city wall, they were insufficient in number. Some locations were poorly constructed due to material shortages. For instance, a portion of the wall between Sun Yat-sen Gate and the Gate of Enlightenment had been reinforced with makeshift structures, concrete on the outside and a fragile network of bamboo within. It was a mere facade that would collapse upon the impact of the first Japanese shell that hit it. Natural obstacles like the Purple Mountain to the east and the Yuhatuai Hills to the south existed, but little was done to incorporate these features into a defensive network. The river, which served as a natural moat, became shallower on the eastern side, allowing for the relatively easy crossing. As further noted by de Fremarie, "Nanjing cannot be justifiably termed a heavily defended city." Meanwhile, the Chinese army was engaged in a frantic effort to prepare for the anticipated Japanese onslaught. Engineers ready to demolish strategic bridges, and in many cases, entire villages were set ablaze, blackening the horizon with thick smoke. Heart-wrenching scenes unfolded as farmers were evicted from homes that had been in their families for generations. By the end of the first week of winter, distant bombings echoed through the air, with explosions powerful enough to rattle windows within the city. The front lines were alarmingly close, leading to a steady influx of injured Chinese soldiers into Nanjing on foot. A pervasive sense of foreboding enveloped the city. Amidst the gloom, there lingered a belief that despite impending challenges, life would somehow just continue status quo. On the morning of November the 3rd, a ship departed from Nanjing loaded with treasures that represented 3 millennia of Chinese history. Thousands of crates filled with irreplaceable bronzes, porcelains, paintings, and other art objects were sent upriver. These invaluable items had been moved from Beijing 4 years earlier, and they were stored in the vaults in Nanjing. It was evident that the situation could deteriorate rapidly, leaving little time to respond. On December the 5th, all American citizens in Nanjing were urged to pack their essential belongings and prepare to leave the city on short notice. The following day, a final order was issued. All American passport holders were directed to make their way to the Yangtze docks and board a river gunboat awaiting them, that being the USS Panay. As the Japanese army advanced westward towards Nanjing, it left behind a horrifying trail of arson, rape, and murder. Helpless civilians who fell into the hands of the victorious soldiers endured brutal treatment that often defied comprehension. Now, similar to other episodes I've done on my own channel or the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, I'm just going to have a little bit of a disclaimer here. I'm about to talk about some really messed up, gut-wrenching stuff. We are reaching closer and closer to Nanjing, and yes, the Battle of Nanjing is a brutal one, and of course afterwards is the infamous Nanjing Massacre, which will be told to its fullest. Henceforth, things are going to get increasingly graphic, so you've been warned. In the small hamlet of Nanchun-to, 38 residents were met with atrocities that would become a much more common theme amongst the Japanese army. The Japanese began by setting fire to 12 homes that comprised the hamlet, forcing the captives to witness the destruction. When some of the residents attempted to escape and salvage their belongings, the soldiers trapped them inside, locking the doors and sealing their fate as the roofs collapsed in flames. Amongst the victims, 2 women, one of whom was pregnant, were subjected to repeated rapes. In a particularly gruesome act, one of the soldiers cut open the belly of a pregnant woman and gouged out her fetus. Amidst the chaos, a 2-year-old boy cried out, and a soldier seized him in front of his mother's arms, throwing him into the flames. The frantic mother was then bayoneted, and her body was discarded into a nearby creek. The remaining captives met a similar fate, dragged to the water's edge, stabbed, and pushed into the stream. The 170 miles between Shanghai and Nanjing transformed into a nightmarish wasteland of death and destruction. The reputation of the Japanese soldiers preceded them, leading many Chinese civilians to prefer a swift death at their own hands rather than the prospect of a slow demise at the hands of the Japanese. For example, while passing through the town of Pinghu on the way to Nanjing, First Lieutenant Nishizawa Benkichi and his men of the 114th Division spotted 2 Chinese girls across a river. They appeared to be strolling hand in hand, possibly sisters. As they stepped onto a bridge, the girls began to walk towards the Japanese soldiers, but then they suddenly stopped, and still clasping hands, they jumped into the river, disappearing into the swift current. Military efficiency was accompanied by a staggering brutality, where victories against armed opponents were often followed by a massacre of the unarmed women and children. This pattern parallels the incomprehensible behavior of German soldiers on the Eastern Front, though there are significant differences. The Germans viewed themselves as a superior race compared to their Slavic adversaries, labeling them as Untermensch. In contrast, the Japanese could not deny their connections to the Chinese. China's historical role as a major influence on Japanese civilization was undeniable, as reflected in aspects as basic as their shared writing system. To many Japanese, their nation's relationship with China resembled that of 2 brothers, one younger and righteous, the other older and misguided, in need of redemption. Matsue embodied this perspective. Alongside his military duties, he held a deep interest in fostering cooperation amongst the peoples of Asia, who he believed remained under the yoke of Western imperialism. Since his youth, Matsue had been captivated by China, and while other ambitious officers sought prestigious positions in Western capitals like Paris or London, he actually applied to serve in China, remaining there for nearly a decade as part of Japan's diplomatic representation. By the 1930s, Matsue's commitment to this Pan-Asian vision had gained a political dimension, leading him to become a prominent founder of the Greater Asia Association in 1933. This, of course, was created mostly through the work of one Ishiwata Kanji. And again, I'm apologizing for the shameless plug, but I once had an exclusive series on my Patreon, but I decided to move it over to Echoes of War, or on my YouTube channel for that member. It's a 4-part series covering the life of Ishiwata Kanji, and it goes into the extensive history of how he tried to forge a kind of Pan-Asianism. But he ultimately failed against his adversaries like Hideki Tojo. It's really fascinating stuff. He was an extremely complicated and bizarre person. So if you're interested, please go over to my YouTube channel and check it out. But if you do, comment where you came from. I'm actually seeing a lot of you guys from the Fall and Rise of China podcast commenting that you came from there, and a lot of you are on my Discord server, which is cool. If more of you want to come over and hang out, we talk about a lot of weird stuff. But back to the story. This organization, though dominated by Japan, had been described as, quote, probably the single most influential organization propagating Pan-Asianism during the 15-Year War. Now, during a visit to China in late 1935, Matsue helped establish the Chinese Greater Asia Association in the northern port city of Tianjin. For individuals like Matsue, Japan's actions in the Asian mainland were akin to liberating its peoples. They viewed the establishment of the Japanese-controlled puppet state of Manchukuo as a bold experiment in nation-building, hoping the rest of China would benefit similarly. As Matsui wrote in 1933, "Next, we must also extend to the 400 million people of China the same help and deep sympathy that we provided to Manchuria, relieving them of their miserable condition of political, economic, and intellectual subjugation by various countries of the Western world." The violence perpetuated by the Japanese army stemmed from numerous variables. One was a grotesque belief that they were actually liberators of what they deemed to be very ungrateful Chinese. The Japanese believed their presence in China was partly for the benefit of the Chinese people, and they felt a messianic obligation to save them. This led to frustration akin to that of a father confronting a disobedient son, compelling them to punish what they perceived as disobedience. While the rank-and-file soldiers might not have reflected deeply on these issues, such philosophies filtered down from their leaders. Of course, there is a lot more to it, and again, I can't believe I'm doing this for the fourth time this episode. I have to shamelessly plug this, but over on my Patreon, I did specifically make an episode titled, Why the Japanese Army Was... It's really complicated, and I actually had to make 10 segments in it and tackle them individually. It runs from, cultural issues to the brutal system of abuse within the Japanese military to the radicalism, simple racism, amongst, other things. And you have to consider this. All these atrocities, they were committed by mostly 20 and 30-year-old grunts who had families back home. This wasn't the stereotypical, I was just following orders type of situation. These were atrocities committed by guys usually with melee weapons. It was more of a bottom-up situation rather than a top-down. And if anybody has the stomach for it, I do have a book to recommend, The Knights of Bushido. It is solely on the subject of the most horrifying things the Japanese did. Now, back over in Nanjing, a safety zone was created by Abe and a handful of other foreigners. It was beginning to take shape in the first week of December. It was officially announced, and 4 committees were established to manage its food, housing, finances, and the sanitation. Once the plans for the zone were publicized in the local newspapers, very scared Chinese civilians began to flock in by the hundreds. From its inception, the zone faced numerous problems. Thousands of bags of rice and flour intended for the future residents of the zone were left unguarded, and they were quickly looted. Many assumed it was actually the Chinese military that looted them. More troubling were the issues that arose when Chinese military units began digging trenches and setting up field telephones within the safety zone, putting it at a heightened risk of Japanese attack. Chinese officers assured organizers that they would vacate the area, but the delay led to a growing frustration amongst those overseeing the zone. Until all the Chinese soldiers withdrew, the organizers could not erect flags to formally designate the area as demilitarized. Although the Japanese refused to officially recognize the safety zone, they pledged to respect it. Following the outbreak of the Battle for Shanghai, the Chinese Red Cross stepped in where military medicine had faltered, establishing first aid teams and emergency hospitals while ensuring that the wounded soldiers were accommodated in existing medical facilities. In October, they opened a 3,000-bed hospital on the campus of the National Central University, staffed by 300 doctors, nurses, and 400 orderlies. By the end of October, the hospital had admitted about 1,200 patients and performed over 50 operations daily, primarily amputations. However, as the Japanese forces advanced towards Nanjing, doctors and nurses were evacuated westward along the Yangtze River. The entire Red Cross hospital was dismantled, and at the American Mission Hospital, the staff, which had initially numbered some 200 doctors, nurses, and trained personnel, dwindled to just 11 by the onset of winter. With medical facilities on the brink of collapse, a group of foreigners took the initiative to improve conditions, achieving some small victories. Now back over at the front, the 10th Army continued their march to Nanjing. On the right flank, the 114th Division had marched through Liang within hours, covering 40 miles over the next 2 days to reach Lishui on December the 4th. Behind them, the 6th Division was still lagging, struggling to catch up after making a very large detour east of Lake Tai. The Kunizaki detachment was tasked with reaching the Yangtze at Taiping, crossing the river and heading for Pukou, directly opposite Nanjing to cut off the retreating Chinese forces. To the left of the 6th and the 114th Divisions was the 18th Division, who had just received orders on December the 2nd to march northwest from Guangdu towards Nanjing. However, when intelligence reports indicated that large numbers of Chinese troops were withdrawing south towards Ningguo, trying to escape the encirclement, the 18th Division was diverted. On December the 4th, they were instructed to change course and press straight west, aiming to trap as many Chinese soldiers as possible. The residents of Nanjing were jolted awake by the roar of airplanes shortly before 6 a.m. on December the 7th. It was actually the sound of Chiang Kai-shek and Song Mei-ling departing the capital. 3 days before this departure, Japanese forces had advanced dangerously close, and their shelling had intensified to the point that they were forced to move from his little private residence on Purple Mountain to a villa belonging to a famous scholar who had just passed away, located within the city walls of Nanjing. While organizing his departure, Chang kept the morale of the troops and civilians trapped in Nanjing at the forefront of his mind. In his diary, he noted, "Staying in Nanjing until the last moment has not only enabled us to complete military preparations, but it has also boosted the morale of soldiers and civilians alike. The evacuation of necessary material has been carried out without disorder. I cannot imagine what might have happened if I had left 10 days earlier." During one of his last nights in Nanjing, Chang had gathered all officers with the rank of Major General and above at Tang Shengzhu's headquarters in the Railroad Ministry. With the First Lady by his side, he delivered an inspiring pep talk ahead of the impending battle, emphasizing that although the Chinese had faced temporary setbacks, they had managed to strike back at the Japanese forces, thwarting their plans for a swift victory. Additionally, he noted that China had garnered the sympathy and the support of the international community. "You're being watched by the entire nation, indeed by the entire world. We cannot abandon Nanjing." He then formally handed over responsibility for the defense of the capital to Tang Shengzhu, urging the officers to obey him as if it was Chang himself. He insisted that this would not be merely a symbolic fight. A sustained defense of Nanjing could actually tie down the Japanese forces, giving the bulk of the Chinese army the opportunity to regroup and strengthen. He promised that 3 divisions, fully equipped and at peak strength, would soon arrive from the southwestern province of Yunnan. He pledged to personally lead them back to Nanjing to break the siege. Meanwhile, on the front of the Shanghai Expeditionary Force, the 16th Division had broken through Chinese lines at the crucial town of Zhurong, located 30 miles east of Nanjing City, and they were now advancing towards the village of Tongshui. To the south, the 9th Division had reached Changhua, another strategic town straddling the approaches to the capital. Meanwhile, to the north, soldiers from the 13th Division were crossing the Yangtze River at Zhenjiang to establish a foothold on the other side. Progress was pretty swift in the 10th Army sector. The 114th Division had advanced all the way to Maolingguan, a town less than 20 miles south of Nanjing. The 6th Division had rushed to the front since the order to capture China's capital had been issued in early December. They are expected to arrive later that day. To the south of these 2 divisions, the 18th Division was set to capture the city of Ningguo, while continuing to push towards the Yangtze, effectively completing the encirclement of Nanjing. By December the 5th, Matsui and his staff completed the transfer from Shanghai to Suzhou, and they issued a general directive for the official attack on Nanjing. This order outlined 2 possible scenarios. In the best-case scenario, the Chinese defenders would surrender and open the city gates. In that event, each Japanese division would send in 1 battalion to complete the pacification of the city and eliminate any remaining pockets of resistance from soldiers unwilling to capitulate. However, in a worst-case scenario, if the Chinese commanders disregarded Japanese offers to surrender and prepared for a prolonged defense of their capital, Japan would unleash the full force of its artillery upon the city. Each division would then send in a regiment to breach city gates and engage in a fierce battle, fighting street by street and house by house. It quickly became evident to the Japanese that Chinese had no intention of simply handing over their capital. New York Times correspondent F. Tillman Durden witnessed some action between the recently arrived 154th and 156th Divisions, both from southern China, who were quickly encircled atop a cone-shaped peak. The Japanese set a ring of fire around the peak. The flames consuming trees and grass gradually crept closer and closer to the summit, forcing the Chinese upward until, all huddled together, they were mercilessly machine-gunned to death. As the Japanese troops closed in on Nanjing, the level of destruction left in the wake of the Chinese defenders became increasingly apparent. Near the capital, hardly a bridge remained intact, as efforts intensified to hinder the invaders. The rush to reach Nanjing heightened rivalries within the Japanese army as well. In early December, soldiers from the 16th Division traversed some hilly terrain at what they believed was a vigorous pace. Suddenly, looking to their left, they spotted a parallel column of Japanese soldiers, quickly identifying them as members of the 9th Division, 35th Regiment. Their company commander shouted, Don't let the 35th beat us to Nanjing. Get moving. Cities, towns, villages, and hamlets lay in the path of Japan's multifaceted advance to Nanjing. Some areas fell without much resistance, while others were fiercely defended by Chinese soldiers determined to hold their ground until the very end. Chun-Hui, a town located roughly 15 miles southeast of Nanjing, was among the latter. The town was defended by troops from the Chinese 51st Infantry Division, who had participated in some of the bloodiest battles at Shanghai. The 51st Division found its withdrawal to Nanjing cut off by the fast-moving Japanese columns. Only with the assistance of local civilians were various units able to sneak back into the capital, filtering through enemy lines. Upon arrival, the division's soldiers had hoped for a chance to cross the Yangtze for some much-needed rest. Instead, Chiang Kai-shek ordered them to immediately reinforce the defenses at Chun-Hui. As the troops arrived in Chun-Hui village in early December, they were dismayed to find the pillboxes in disrepair. Some bunkers had been buried far too deep to function effectively as defensive structures, while others had excessively large embrasures that offered little to no protection from enemy fire. Most frustratingly, keys to the bunkers were often missing, making entry pretty problematic. The division worked tirelessly to improve their positions using whatever materials could be taken in the area, but time was short to bring up the defenses to any standard. Nonetheless, they achieved significant upgrades: 3 lines of defense in front of Chun-Hui, centered around several pillboxes, 2 rows of barbed wire, and an anti-tank ditch to complicate any advance. Hidden machine gun nests also provided surprises for the Japanese infantry. On December the 4th, the Japanese vanguard, a column of about 500 soldiers from the 9th Division, were spotted, and over the next 2 days, the company defending Shuhu endured some pretty intense assaults. The Chinese dispatched an armored platoon as temporary reinforcements, marking one of the rare instances where Chinese tanks confronted Japanese infantry directly. The Chinese lost 3 armored vehicles, while the Japanese reported around 40 casualties amongst their infantry. By the late afternoon on December the 6th, the surviving Chinese soldiers at Shuhu, numbering fewer than just 30, abandoned their positions and would have to fight their way back to Chun-Hui, leaving a lot of fallen comrades behind. Advancing units of Japan's 9th Division pursued them very closely, initially avoiding contact with the Chinese defenses to conduct reconnaissance. Based on their observations, the Japanese concluded that although the Chinese defenses appeared well prepared, they were pretty thinly manned. Costly fighting resulted in the Japanese gaining control over only the first of the 3 Chinese defensive lines. Determined to capture the next 2 lines, they once again depended heavily upon their artillery. In several sectors along the front, soldiers of the 9th Division found themselves caught in some really deadly crossfire from some Chinese machine guns, creating a virtual kill zone from which no one could escape. For the Chinese defenders, the conditions were equally horrific. As recalled by the commander of the Chinese 51st Division, Wang Yaowu, the shelling was incessant. Body parts were flying through the air. Some men lost legs, others arms. Brains were splattered everywhere. The division's 301st Regiment, which bore the brunt of the battle, suffered approximately 1,500 casualties amongst their officers and soldiers. During the second day of battle, the Japanese left flank made some gains, penetrating the area behind the village. The breakthrough, however, came in the afternoon of December the 8th, when an entire regiment that had been lagging behind the rest of the 9th Division arrived just in time to join the fight. This bolstered the morale of Japanese troops and provided momentum for the attack. By the end of the day, Chun-Hui was firmly under Japanese control. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War week-by-week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of those, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As the Japanese forces advanced, Nanjing's fate teetered on the brink. Commander Tang Shengzhu led a beleaguered defense amidst all of the chaos. By December the 1st, General Matsue officially ordered an assault upon Nanjing. And as the Japanese troops closed in, brutality loomed on the horizon, heralding one of China's darkest chapters in its fight against oppression.